large parts of the country, there are zero or very few COVID-19 cases. So the question I have is, why is there a one-size-fits-all policy? So the Philippine education system is a rather complex, quite dispersed across a large archipelago. And it's quite fragmented, comprised of many multiple moving parts, very diverse. And you can see from the screen, we have one Department of Education, but it's implemented in 17 regions. And each of the regions is divided into about 8 to 14, 15 school divisions. So we've got about 225 across the country. And each of the school divisions has a quite a number of school districts. So it's about 2,200 all over the country, 62,000 public schools, about 8,500 private schools, over 900,000 public school teachers, and about 1 million if you add the private school teachers. So it's quite a complex system. And then on top of that, we have an autonomous region in Bangsamoro, autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, which is not under the Department of Education, but it functions like the Department of Education. Okay, so in effect, it's like an 18th region. If you take a look at the system, there are what I call creative tensions, and I say creative rather than destructive tensions. They're actually good for the system, but if you don't manage it properly, it can get out of control. Okay, so the first tension is centralized control over the entire system versus decentralized operations. So standards are set at the central office, but interpretation of the standards are done in the region. And as a result of that, you can have different interpretations of what those standards could be, and sometimes it can be at cross purposes. So there's a tension between the central office, the DepEd central office, and the regions and the divisions in this regard. And there's also a tension between the Department of Education and local stakeholders, such as the local governments, who do not report to Department of Education, but where the local school boards, for example, are controlled. The local school boards are part of the local governments, and so they should be following what the Department of Education is mandating or saying. However, that's not necessarily always the case, right? So there is that tension between local governments and the Department of Education. I'm sorry. Okay, let me. As I show the slides, I will go through I will explain what's on the slide. Okay, this slide says local context matters, and so there's a lot of demographic, socioeconomic, social-political situation on the ground in a particular place or locality, which can have an impact or an effect on education. The first is on income class disparities, and that continues today. So if you take a look at the poor to low income classes, that's about 40.5% of the population of all families. Lower middle income is about 36% of all families. Middle to upper middle income is about 20.7% of all families. And the upper income and the rich only account for about 2.5% of all families. Okay, so this context will have an impact because the low income and the lower middle income families are the ones who are, put it this way, in terms of equity, they're the ones who are most disadvantaged. Okay, and so their numbers tend to be lower in terms of participation compared to the higher income groups. The second tension is with reference to ethnicity and language group. And if you take a look at the country, the Department of Education has recognized 19 language groups. So in the very early years, the mother tongue instruction is done in those local language groups before it transitions to English and Filipino, which is the national language. But you can imagine the tension here because kids in many of the outlying areas do not speak English or Filipino as the language at home. They speak their local language or local dialect. Then you have local norms. And this is especially among the very, very rural, very remote areas and certain indigenous people communities where you have child marriage, for example, which takes kids out of school. And then in very, very poor communities, you've got child labor, which also takes kids out of school. Right? So these are some of the contexts we have to be aware in terms of policy implementation. Okay, let me just say a few things about policy setting. When you set policy, you are really setting a direction for everybody. Once you set that policy, that is good for everybody. It applies to all. So we want policy that benefits the vast majority of society. Even the best of policy, you will have gainers and there will be losers for any given policy. The key is to have the gainers far outweigh or outnumber the losers. Or those who are losing, you want to make sure that the value of the loss is not too large that it will cause problems in the implementation, even if they are the minority. Remember, in situations where you have losers, especially very vocal losers, the vocal minority can lead a revolt. And this can cause problems for everybody in the system. If there are losers in the system, you want to make sure that there is a way by which you can pick up the losers, especially those who fall along the margins or fall between the cracks. And here you use affirmative action programs to pick these groups up. So the policy applies to everybody, but an affirmative action program can be targeted to certain groups to make sure that these groups can be picked up and can be brought back into the system. Okay, the other thing is you've got the structurally disadvantaged. And here you've got structural barriers in society that can exclude groups wittingly or unwittingly. So here are some examples. In the Philippines, we have what is called GIDA, Geographically Isolated and Disadvantaged Areas. These are areas which are so remote, they tend to get forgotten and left out of the system. So the Department of Education, a couple of years ago, articulated a program called Last Mile Schools to try to reach out to these communities to make sure that schooling, education services were available to them. Unfortunately, GIDI or last mile areas are also the most expensive on a per capita basis to reach. One is they're isolated. Two is that they have no infrastructure, so you've got to develop that infrastructure. Or you may not have the human resource, so you've got to move human resources out there. And not everybody wants to move to isolated areas. So these can be very expensive, but it needs to be done. Unfortunately, in this pandemic, it has been put on the back burner, and we've got to get back to it because there are quite a few thousand schools or quite a few areas where this is a problem. Okay, then you've got historically discriminated communities. So in the Philippines, an example of this would be the Muslim Filipino population. So we are a predominantly Catholic Christian nation, and historically, the Muslim Filipino population has been discriminated or left out. And that's why there's an autonomous region that's dealing with this, because that's where the Muslim Filipino population is the majority. But we need to be constantly aware of this because there are Muslim Filipino communities in the general area, not within the autonomous region. Then we've got migrant worker communities. So these are communities that move around, and because they move around, they tend not to have a lot of basic social services, including education, and they tend to be discriminated or left out because of that. We need to make sure that we're always aware of this. All right, so let me go to this pandemic just to make a case of how policy and policy implementation may be at cross purposes. So the Philippine government closed all schools to face-to-face instruction in March of 2020. This is the longest school closure in the world, I believe, certainly in Southeast Asia. And what's happened here, in fact, it's only last week that a handful of schools, in the Department of Education, 100 schools were allowed to open up, 100 public schools and 20 private schools were allowed to open up to face-to-face instruction. This is a drop in the bucket compared to the total number of schools, which is about 62,000 schools all over the country. So the government has allowed these schools to open to face-to-face on a limited basis, on a pilot basis. The reality of it is that for all the other schools, they've had to continue with distance learning. And the problem is when this happened last year, and really even up to today, the Department of Education, the schools, and the communities were not ready for distance learning. Okay, so the second reality, and this is where I want to point out, large parts of the country, there are zero or very few COVID-19 cases. So the question I have is, why shut down areas with no or few COVID cases? Because the National Capital Region and the neighboring areas or large metropolitan areas have numerous cases. So why is there a one-size-fits-all policy? It doesn't make any sense. We could have learned from the rest of ASEAN, where schools have been open for many, many months, really over a year in some cases, in some countries. They continue to do aggressive testing in these communities. They've set up the protocols. They're prepared to shut down the schools and quarantine them if COVID cases occur. And they're starting to vaccinate teachers and students. So there are ways other countries have done it. Why couldn't the Philippines have done this? And I think this is a real shortcoming in terms of our policy. Thank you.